Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On the 12th of October 1917, the Branson Beacon published a brief notice that would later prove to be the first public hint of unspeakable horror unfolding in Stone County. The article, buried on page 4 between advertisements for patent medicines and harvest equipment, reported a mysterious illness affecting the Chapman boarding house near Galena. The tone was dismissive, describing it as merely another case of seasonal ailments that often struck during the transition from summer to autumn. What caught the attention of later investigators was a peculiar detail, mentioned almost in passing, that no local doctor had been summoned to treat the afflicted guests, despite the severity of their symptoms. The reporter noted this oddity but offered no explanation, perhaps assuming that Mrs. Chapman, known for her resourcefulness, was managing the situation with home remedies. The article mentioned that concerned relatives had made inquiries about loved ones staying at the establishment, but these concerns were addressed with assurances that all was well and the illness was passing. This 3-paragraph notice, so easily overlooked among the day's mundane news, would later be recognized as the first warning sign of events that would shock the community and leave a dark stain on the region's history. The Chapman boarding house, respected for years as a comfortable way station for travelers and seasonal workers, was harboring secrets that would soon transform it from a place of refuge into a chamber of calculated death. Yet, on that October day, readers of the Branson Beacon simply turned the page, unaware that they had just glimpsed the edge of an abyss that would soon open to reveal horrors beyond their comprehension. The Chapman boarding house stood as a testament to faded grandeur on the outskirts of Galena, Missouri. Its 3-story Victorian frame perched dramatically on a limestone bluff overlooking the James River. Built in 1888 by a prosperous lead mine owner, the structure boasted elaborate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that offered spectacular views of the river valley below. By 1917, the house had passed through several hands before coming into the possession of Edith Chapman, a widow of 43 years who had inherited it from her late husband Theodore in 1914. Theodore Chapman had been a respected merchant in Galena until consumption claimed him, leaving Edith with substantial debts and a property too large for a woman alone. Rather than sell, she transformed the residence into a boarding house that quickly gained a reputation for cleanliness, substantial meals, and the proprietress's particular attention to her guests' comfort. Regular boarders spoke highly of Mrs. Chapman's cooking, especially her hearty stews and fresh-baked bread that drew travelers from considerable distances. The establishment could accommodate up to 15 guests in its 8 bedrooms, with shared facilities that were considered modern for the time. The isolation of the property, reached by a winding road that climbed from the river valley, was seen as an asset by many guests who appreciated the quiet atmosphere and cool breezes that swept up from the water. Local merchants knew Edith as a reliable customer who paid her accounts promptly and maintained high standards for her provisions. She employed 2 local women for cleaning and laundry, though they did not live on the premises, returning to town each evening before dark. The house itself seemed to reflect its owner's character, with its well-maintained appearance, carefully tended gardens, and the warm glow of oil lamps that welcomed weary travelers as dusk fell over the Ozark hills. No one suspected that this beacon of hospitality would soon become a place where that very trust between host and guest would be violated in the most horrific ways imaginable. The first signs of something amiss at the Chapman boarding house emerged gradually through the observations of those who had regular business with the establishment, creating a pattern that only became clear in tragic hindsight. Margaret Holden, who had supplied fresh eggs to Mrs. Chapman every Tuesday for 3 years, later testified that she noticed a marked change beginning in August 1917, where once the boarding house bustled with activity and required 3 dozen eggs per delivery. By late August, she was asked to bring only a single dozen. Mrs. Chapman explained the decrease as a temporary lull in business, but Margaret observed that the usually sociable landlady had become withdrawn and seemed eager to complete their transactions quickly at the back door, rather than inviting her in for tea, as was customary. The most significant change coincided with the arrival of Edith's nephew, Charles Morrison, a young man of 19 who appeared at the boarding house in early August with a military discharge and a persistent cough that Edith attributed to gas exposure in France. Charles was given a room on the 3rd floor, an area previously used only for storage, and immediately began assisting his aunt with the daily operations of the house. Within days of his arrival, the first reports of illness among the boarders began to circulate. Samuel Jeffries, a traveling hardware salesman who had stayed at the house regularly for 2 years, fell ill with symptoms that resembled severe influenza, but with peculiar variations that puzzled those who witnessed his decline. County records, examined decades later, revealed unusual purchases made by Edith Chapman during this period, including substantial quantities of carbolic acid, quicklime, and various chemical compounds typically used for industrial purposes rather than domestic cleaning. The local pharmacist, Henry Bowman, recalled that Mrs. Chapman had claimed she needed these supplies for an extensive renovation project, though no workers were ever seen at the property. These seemingly unrelated observations would eventually form a disturbing picture of preparation for acts that would transform the respectable boarding house into a scene of methodical horror. The discovery of Samuel Pritchard's journal in 1952 during the demolition of an old hotel in Joplin provided the first detailed eyewitness account of life inside the Chapman boarding house during those fatal weeks of September 1917. Pritchard, a 34-year-old pharmaceutical supplies salesman, had maintained meticulous daily entries throughout his travels, and his 3-week stay at the Chapman establishment proved no exception. His initial entries praised the accommodations and Mrs. Chapman's solicitous attention to her guests' needs, noting particularly the generous portions at meals and the soothing teas she served in the evenings. However, by his 4th day, Pritchard began recording troubling observations about his fellow boarders, writing that Mr. Jeffries, who had seemed to be recovering from his illness, had suddenly taken a dramatic turn for the worse after consuming a special broth prepared by Mrs. Chapman's nephew, Charles. The journal entries grew increasingly concerned as Pritchard documented a pattern where guests would show improvement, express intentions to leave, then mysteriously relapse into deeper illness. He wrote of experiencing drowsiness and mental confusion after evening meals, forcing himself to dispose of the tea rather than drink it after noticing these effects. His descriptions of the locked 3rd floor became progressively more detailed, recording sounds of footsteps, furniture being moved, and what he described as mechanical noises like metal instruments being cleaned. On September 18th, Pritchard wrote his most chilling entry, describing how he had feigned sleep when Charles Morrison entered his room after midnight, standing silently by his bed for several minutes before departing. The next morning, Pritchard claimed urgent business had arisen and departed immediately, later writing that he believed this abrupt exit saved his life. His final entry regarding the Chapman house, dated September 20th from a hotel in Springfield, expressed his conviction that something deeply sinister was occurring at the boarding house, and his regret at not alerting authorities. Though he admitted he had no concrete evidence beyond his growing certainty that guests were being deliberately poisoned, the private notes of Dr. Josiah Whitmore, discovered among his estate papers in 1961, revealed that at least one member of the local medical community harbored serious suspicions about the Chapman boarding house well before the ultimate discovery of its horrors. Whitmore, who had practiced medicine in Stone County for over 30 years, first became concerned when 2 men who had fled the boarding house sought his treatment in early September 1917. Both patients presented with similar symptoms, including severe gastric distress, mental confusion, muscle weakness, and what Whitmore described as signs consistent with chronic exposure to toxic substances rather than any natural disease. When he attempted to make a professional visit to the Chapman house on September 24th to examine other reportedly ill boarders, he was met at the door by Charles Morrison, who claimed that quarantine protocols prevented any visitors from entering. Whitmore found this explanation suspicious, particularly since no official quarantine had been declared by county health authorities. His notes reveal growing frustration as he documented his attempts to involve local officials, writing that Sheriff Brennan seemed reluctant to investigate without more concrete evidence than the doctor's professional opinion. Whitmore began his own investigation, learning from local suppliers that the Chapman house had been ordering medical supplies typically used in surgical procedures, including ether, chloroform, and various antiseptic solutions. The doctor's journal entries from early October show increasing alarm as he compiled reports of men who had entered the boarding house and simply vanished, their disappearances explained away by Mrs. Chapman as departures in the night or transfers to hospitals in larger cities. His final entry on the matter, dated October 15th, expressed his determination to force an official investigation, writing that he would present his evidence to state authorities if local officials continued to ignore what he termed clear signs of systematic poisoning. Whitmore's persistence would ultimately play a crucial role in prompting the official investigation that would uncover the full extent of the horrors concealed within the Chapman boarding house. October 1917 marked a dramatic escalation in the deadly activities at the Chapman boarding house, a pattern later reconstructed through careful examination of bank records, supply orders, and the scattered testimonies of those who had final interactions with the establishment during this period. After October 1st, the house accepted no new guests, with Edith Chapman turning away prospective boarders with claims that all rooms were occupied by long-term residents recovering from illness. Yet, delivery records showed food orders decreasing, rather than maintaining levels appropriate for a full house, suggesting the number of living occupants was steadily diminishing. The mail carrier, Eugene Patterson, later testified that beginning October 3rd, no letters were left for collection in the house's mailbox, breaking a pattern of regular correspondence that had existed for years. More disturbing still were the reports of strange odors carried on the autumn winds, described by farmers in the valley below as sweet yet putrid, unlike anything from normal household activities. The final grocery delivery on October 8th provided the last confirmed sighting of Edith Chapman by an outsider before the investigation began. Young Timothy Mills, age 16, who assisted grocer Abraham Foster with deliveries, would later describe his encounter with a dramatically changed Mrs. Chapman that day, where once she had been meticulously groomed and properly dressed, she appeared at the door with disheveled hair, wearing a stained apron, and exhibiting what Timothy called a wild energy in her eyes. She grabbed the supplies with unusual haste, thrusting payment at the boy without counting it, and ordering him to leave immediately and not return. Timothy reported that as the door closed, he glimpsed Charles Morrison in the hallway behind his aunt, wearing what appeared to be a leather apron of the sort used by surgeons or butchers. The boy's account of feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as he departed would prove to be the last warning before the full horror of what had transpired within those walls would be revealed to the world. Sheriff William Brennan's official visit to the Chapman boarding house on October 20th, 1917, came after mounting pressure from relatives of missing boarders and the persistent advocacy of Dr. Whitmore finally overcame his initial reluctance to investigate. Accompanied by 2 deputies, Brennan arrived at the property on a gray Saturday morning to find an apparently abandoned house with no response to repeated knocking and calling. The front door stood slightly ajar, moving slowly in the breeze, while dead leaves had accumulated on the porch, suggesting no one had swept for days. Upon entering, the sheriff's party found a scene of strange contradictions, with some areas meticulously clean, while others showed signs of hasty abandonment. The parlor remained perfectly arranged as if awaiting guests, but the kitchen revealed half-prepared food, now moldering on the counters and flies circling above congealed pots on the cold stove. The dining room table was set for 8, though several chairs had been overturned, and dark stains on the tablecloth suggested spilled wine or something more sinister. As they moved through the ground floor, Deputy Harrison discovered the kitchen cellar door secured with a new padlock that seemed incongruous with the apparent abandonment of the property. The air grew thick with an unpleasant odor as they descended after breaking the lock, their lanterns revealing shelves lined with preserve jars whose contents were definitely not fruits or vegetables. Personal effects were scattered throughout the cellar, including wallets, watches, rings, and other items, suggesting at least 12 different individuals had been present in the house. A ledger found on a shelf contained entries in Edith Chapman's precise handwriting, listing names, dates of arrival, and cryptic notations about treatments administered and responses observed. The sheriff's most disturbing discovery on the ground floor was a door leading to what should have been a pantry, but had been converted into a small chamber containing restraints attached to the walls and floor, with dark stains that testified to its grim purpose. The breaking down of the locked third-floor door revealed a scene that caused hardened lawmen to recoil in horror and would haunt the dreams of those who witnessed it for years to come. What Edith Chapman and her nephew had created was a makeshift medical facility that spoke to both sophisticated knowledge and complete moral abandonment. 3 rooms had been converted into what could only be described as an amateur operating theater, with tables bearing leather straps, surgical instruments laid out with military precision, and glass containers holding preserved specimens that no ethical medical practitioner would have collected. Sheriff Brennan's report, written in language that struggled to maintain professional detachment, described finding evidence of surgical procedures that went far beyond any legitimate medical purpose. Charts on the walls, drawn in Charles Morrison's hand, detailed human anatomy with particular attention to organs and glandular systems, annotated with notes about extraction techniques and preservation methods. A journal found on a desk revealed Charles's distorted interpretation of his military medical training, combining legitimate surgical knowledge with bizarre theories about disease, resistance, and biological enhancement through what he termed essence transference. The deputies discovered a storage room containing glass jars with labels indicating dates and initials, their contents representing a catalog of horror that defied rational explanation. Most disturbing was what appeared to be an active experiment area, where various chemical apparatus suggested ongoing attempts to distill or process biological materials. Deputy Thompson, a veteran of numerous criminal investigations, later testified that he refused to remain in the building after sunset, convinced that the very walls had absorbed the evil that had transpired within them. The surgical modifications evident on several preserved specimens indicated a progression from simple organ removal to increasingly complex procedures that served no medical purpose, but seemed driven by a twisted curiosity about human anatomy. The sheriff ordered the entire floor sealed pending a full investigation, though he privately doubted whether any investigation could fully comprehend the depth of depravity they had uncovered. The excavation of the root cellar behind the Chapman boarding house, ordered by Sheriff Brennan and conducted under the supervision of Dr. Whitmore, revealed the full extent of the murders that had taken place on the property. Working with a team of deputized citizens, the grim task began on October 22nd and continued for 4 days, uncovering human remains in various states of preservation that told a story of systematic killing. Dr. Whitmore's examination confirmed what he had long suspected, that the victims had been poisoned with a combination of substances that would have caused initial weakness and disorientation, making them manageable for what came next. The positioning of the remains indicated they had been buried at different times, with the earliest dating back to late August, shortly after Charles Morrison's arrival. What made the discoveries particularly horrifying were the surgical modifications evident on many of the corpses, precise incisions and organ removals that spoke to medical knowledge applied to murderous purpose. The doctor's official report noted that several victims showed evidence of procedures performed while they were still alive, restrained, and possibly conscious during their final moments. The correlation between the remains and missing persons reports from across Missouri and neighboring states revealed that the Chapman house had drawn victims from a wide area, men whose transient lifestyles made their disappearances less likely to draw immediate attention. Among the personal effects buried with the bodies were letters never sent, business cards, and photographs of families who would never see their loved ones again. The peculiar surgical modifications, Dr. Whitmore noted, seemed to focus on glands and organs that Charles Morrison's journal had identified as crucial to disease resistance, suggesting a twisted logic behind the killings. By the excavation's end, partial remains of 19 individuals had been recovered, though evidence suggested more victims might be buried in locations yet undiscovered on the property or disposed of in the nearby James River. The investigation into Charles Morrison's background revealed a troubled young man whose military medical service had ended under circumstances that, in retrospect, should have served as a warning of his dangerous potential. Military records showed that Private Morrison had been assigned to a field hospital in France, where he served as an orderly assisting with the treatment of gas attack victims. His commanding officer, Major Robert Fielding, had written several disciplinary reports documenting Morrison's unhealthy fascination with the effects of chemical weapons on human tissue and his requests to participate in autopsies despite lacking proper qualification. The final incident that led to his discharge involved Morrison being discovered conducting unauthorized examinations on deceased soldiers, removing tissue samples that he claimed were for personal study. The official discharge cited nervous exhaustion and battle fatigue, a charitable interpretation that avoided the scandal of court-martial proceedings. Letters discovered in the Chapman house revealed that Charles had maintained correspondence with his aunt throughout his service, sharing increasingly disturbing theories about disease and immunity that seemed to excite rather than concern her. In one letter dated June 1917, he wrote extensively about his belief that exposure to certain refined essences extracted from those who had survived gas attacks could provide immunity to future chemical or biological threats. Edith's responses showed a woman already predisposed to accept such theories, perhaps influenced by her isolation and the loss of her husband to disease. She wrote of preparing a proper workspace for his experiments, and her eagerness to assist in what she termed his important research. The correspondence revealed a folie à deux developing through letters, with aunt and nephew reinforcing each other's delusions and planning for Charles's return. Local acquaintances of Edith Chapman reported that she had become increasingly interested in medical texts and chemical supplies in the months before Charles arrived, suggesting she was already preparing to enable his twisted ambitions before he set foot in the boarding house. Analysis of Edith Chapman's detailed records, discovered hidden within the walls during the 1952 demolition, provided chilling insight into the delusions that drove the murders at the boarding house. Her journal revealed an obsession with reports of a devastating influenza outbreak in military camps, which she believed heralded a pandemic that would devastate the civilian population. Working from Charles's distorted medical theories, she had convinced herself that they were racing against time to develop immunity through what she termed controlled exposure protocols. The journal entries showed a gradual descent from concern about public health to a messianic conviction that she and Charles were chosen to survive the coming plague through their willingness to do what others could not. Her writings revealed a sophisticated understanding of certain medical concepts, likely gleaned from Charles's letters and her own reading, twisted into a rationalization for murder. She documented each victim with clinical detachment, noting their physical condition upon arrival, their response to various substances administered in food and drink, and the results of Charles's procedures. What emerged was a picture of systematic experimentation, with early victims serving as test subjects for refining their methods. The pseudo-scientific theories she embraced included beliefs about vital essences contained within specific organs, the transfer of immunity through consumption or injection of processed materials, and elaborate calculations about dosages and timing that revealed a methodical approach to their crimes. Most disturbing were entries expressing frustration when victims died too quickly, or pride when they managed to keep someone alive longer for extended procedures. Her final entries, written in early October, showed increasing paranoia about discovery, combined with grandiose statements about their importance to human survival. She wrote of visions where she and Charles emerged from the coming pandemic as the progenitors of a new immune human strain, having paid the necessary price in lesser lives to achieve biological transcendence. The multi-state manhunt launched in November 1917 for Edith Chapman and Charles Morrison represented one of the largest coordinated law enforcement efforts in the region's history, yet ultimately yielded frustratingly few results. Initial investigations focused on railway stations and riverboat docks, with photographs of the pair circulated to ticket agents and captains throughout Missouri and neighboring states. The discovery of their abandoned wagon near the Arkansas border, 3 weeks after the boarding house investigation, suggested they had planned their escape carefully, switching to alternative transportation to throw off pursuit. The wagon contained clothing and personal effects that seemed deliberately left to create false leads, including train tickets to Chicago that investigators later determined had never been used. Reports flooded in of sightings from as far away as Texas and Tennessee, but most proved to be cases of mistaken identity or attention seekers. The most credible sighting came from a boarding house owner in Fort Smith, Arkansas, who reported that a woman matching Edith's description and a younger man claiming to be her son had sought rooms in early November, but left abruptly when asked to sign the register. Bank records showed that Edith had withdrawn substantial sums in the weeks before the discoveries, suggesting careful financial preparation for life as fugitives. Local law enforcement in small towns throughout the Ozarks reported numerous instances of break-ins at pharmacies and medical supply companies during this period, though none could be definitively linked to the fleeing pair. The search was complicated by the approaching winter and the isolated nature of many Ozark communities, where strangers could disappear into the hills or find shelter with residents who asked few questions. By December, with America's entry into World War I dominating headlines and resources, the intensive manhunt was reduced to periodic bulletins and reliance on local authorities to remain vigilant for the fugitive pair. The Chapman boarding house quickly acquired a reputation as cursed ground following the revelations of October 1917, with locals refusing to venture near the property after dark and reporting strange phenomena that seemed to defy rational explanation. Multiple attempts to sell the property failed, as prospective buyers invariably withdrew after visiting, citing an oppressive atmosphere and inexplicable feelings of dread. The first attempt at demolition in 1918 ended when workers reported tools mysteriously moving overnight, and several men suffered unexplained accidents, leading the crew to abandon the job. Stories circulated of lights seen moving in the third-floor windows despite the building being sealed and empty. Descriptions consistent enough across multiple witnesses to suggest more than mere imagination. A family who briefly attempted to live in the house in 1923 fled after 3 nights. The father telling neighbors that they heard surgical instruments clinking and footsteps pacing the 3rd floor, though investigation revealed no physical source for the sounds. The property's effect seemed to extend beyond the structure itself, as the surrounding area experienced a notable decline, with trees dying without apparent cause and animals avoiding the grounds. Local children developed elaborate dares involving touching the house's walls or peering through its windows, though few managed to complete these challenges before overwhelming fear drove them away. Photographers attempting to document the building reported consistent problems with equipment malfunctions and film that developed showing inexplicable shadows and distortions. By the 1940 seconds, the house had partially collapsed from neglect, yet reports of phenomena continued, including the sound of Edith Chapman's voice, calling out as if welcoming guests, and the smell of medicinal chemicals wafting from the ruins on still nights. The local community's relationship with the property remained one of fearful avoidance, with even hardened skeptics admitting to experiencing unsettling sensations when forced to pass too close to what remained of the Chapman boarding house. The 1952 discovery of additional documents during the renovation of the Stone County Courthouse provided shocking new details about the extent of Edith Chapman and Charles Morrison's crimes. Workers removing old filing cabinets found a hidden compartment containing Edith's complete journals and Charles's medical notes, materials presumably hidden by someone sympathetic to the pair, or perhaps by one of them during a clandestine return to the area. These documents revealed that the 19 bodies found in 1917 represented only a portion of their victims, with the journals documenting at least 23 individuals subjected to their experiments over just 2 months. The medical notes showed a progression in their techniques, from crude poisonings to increasingly sophisticated procedures aimed at extracting what they believed were immunity-producing substances. Charles's writings revealed a mind that combined genuine medical knowledge with fantastic theories, creating detailed anatomical drawings annotated with his beliefs about essence concentration points and optimal extraction methods. Edith's journals from this period showed her complete acceptance of her nephew's theories and her active participation in selecting victims based on their perceived health and vitality. The documents included correspondence with medical supply companies using false names and addresses, showing how they obtained surgical instruments and chemicals without arousing suspicion. Most disturbing were Charles's sketches for future experiments, including plans for live tissue transfers and cross-species procedures that revealed an ambition extending far beyond their actual crimes. The journals also contained a list of potential safe houses and contacts throughout the Midwest, suggesting a network of sympathizers or unwitting accomplices who might have aided their escape. University researchers studying these materials noted the sophisticated understanding of human psychology displayed in their victim selection and manipulation techniques, choosing men without close family ties and creating plausible explanations for their disappearances that delayed investigation. Modern psychiatric evaluation of the Chapman-Morrison case has provided valuable insights into the psychological dynamics that enabled such extensive and systematic killing. Dr. Helena Rothschild's 1975 analysis identified the relationship between Edith and Charles as a textbook example of shared psychotic disorder, or folie à deux, where delusions are transmitted from one person to another who would not otherwise have developed them independently. The traumatic effects of Charles's war experience, particularly his exposure to gas attack victims and the industrialized slaughter of trench warfare, combined with pre-existing personality disorders to create a fractured psyche seeking control through medical dominance. His letters home showed progressive dehumanization of patients, referring to them increasingly as specimens rather than people, a psychological defense mechanism that ultimately enabled him to view murder as mere research. Edith's psychological profile revealed a woman isolated by widowhood and financial stress, whose need for purpose and connection made her vulnerable to her nephew's influence. The loss of her husband to disease had created an obsessive fear of illness that Charles's theories transformed into a proactive, if delusional, attempt at prevention. Their elaborate justifications for murder revealed sophisticated cognitive mechanisms for maintaining their delusions, including viewing victims as willing sacrifices to the greater good of human survival and interpreting their suffering as necessary steps in an important process. The systematic nature of their crimes, with detailed record-keeping and methodical procedures, suggested an ability to compartmentalize their actions, functioning normally in some areas, while committing atrocities in others. Dr. Rothschild noted that their shared isolation in the boarding house created an echo chamber where delusional beliefs were reinforced rather than challenged, with each person's participation validating the other's worldview. The psychiatric evaluation concluded that while both individuals bore full moral responsibility for their crimes, the psychological mechanisms that enabled them offered important insights into how ordinary people can be transformed into perpetrators of extraordinary evil. The 1958 discovery of death certificates in San Francisco, matching the descriptions of Edith Chapman and Charles Morrison, provided an ironic conclusion to their flight from justice, revealing that they had ultimately succumbed to the very pandemic they had murdered to prevent. Records from San Francisco General Hospital showed that a woman named Elizabeth Chambers, age 46, and her nephew Carl Morris, age 23, died within days of each other in November 1918 during the height of the Spanish influenza outbreak. Physical descriptions, ages adjusted for the passage of time, and other details strongly suggested these were the fugitives living under assumed names. Hospital staff notes described Elizabeth as delirious in her final days, speaking of immunity protocols and begging for her special medicines, while Carl reportedly died insisting that their work had been important and would be vindicated by history. The attending physician noted their unusual scars and what appeared to be self-administered injection sites, suggesting they had continued some form of their experiments during their time in California. Boarding house records showed they had lived quietly in the Richmond district for several months, with the landlady describing them as peculiar but harmless tenants who kept irregular hours and received frequent deliveries of medical supplies. The irony of their deaths from influenza after murdering dozens in pursuit of immunity was not lost on investigators, who saw it as a form of cosmic justice for crimes that had escaped earthly punishment. Evidence found in their rooms after their deaths suggested they had continued their experiments on a smaller scale, though apparently limiting themselves to animal subjects and self-experimentation. A final journal entry, presumably written by Edith as she fell ill, expressed bewilderment that their preparations had failed and a desperate hope that someone would continue their work, showing that delusion persisted even in the face of ultimate failure. The lasting impact of the Chapman boarding house murders on Stone County and its residents extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crimes, creating psychological scars that persisted through generations and fundamentally altering the community's sense of trust and safety. Interviews conducted with descendants of both survivors and victims revealed how deeply the events had affected family narratives, with some maintaining decades of silence, while others became obsessed with uncovering every detail. The granddaughter of Samuel Pritchard, whose journal had provided crucial evidence, described how her grandfather never again stayed in a boarding house and would test his food carefully at every meal, trauma responses that his family initially found puzzling until learning of his narrow escape. The murders contributed to a broader breakdown of the boarding house system in rural Missouri, as travelers became wary of isolated establishments and proprietors found themselves under increased scrutiny. The community of Galena developed what sociologists later termed collective trauma symptoms, including persistent rumors about other hidden victims, suspicion of medical professionals, and reluctance to accept strangers that lasted well into the 1,960 seconds. Local historians documented how the case influenced everything from zoning laws that prevented isolated commercial establishments to informal networks that vetted newcomers more thoroughly than in other communities. The demolition of the boarding house in 1961 was attended by hundreds of residents in what observers described as an exorcism of collective memory, though the discovery of additional remains during the process reopened wounds many had thought healed. Educational institutions in the region incorporated the case into curricula about the dangers of isolation and unchecked authority, using it as a cautionary tale about how evil can flourish when communities fail to maintain connections and oversight. The psychological impact extended to the medical community, with local doctors reporting that for decades afterward, patients showed unusual reluctance to accept medications or treatments, a direct result of how medical knowledge had been perverted in the Chapman house. The Chapman-Morrison case continues to raise profound questions about the nature of evil, the vulnerability of isolated communities, and the dangerous convergence of trauma, delusion, and opportunity that can transform seemingly ordinary people into predators. The gaps in the historical record, including the possibility of victims along their escape route who were never connected to the case, serve as reminders of how many crimes may go undetected when victims are chosen from society's margins. The influence of World War I trauma on Charles Morrison's psychology presaged what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in his case, combining with existing personality disorders to create homicidal rather than self-destructive behaviors. The social isolation that enabled the crimes reflected broader patterns in early 20th century America, where the breakdown of traditional community structures and the mobility of modern life created spaces where predators could operate with minimal oversight. Modern analysis of the case has revealed how the approaching influenza pandemic, which would kill more Americans than the war itself, cast a shadow that both motivated and ultimately concealed these crimes as public attention shifted to the larger catastrophe. The realization that Edith and Charles's paranoid fears about pandemic disease, while twisted into justification for murder, proved prophetically accurate about the devastating flu outbreak adds a layer of tragic irony to their story. Forensic psychiatrists studying the case note how their delusions contained kernels of truth about disease transmission and immunity that, pursued through legitimate channels, might have contributed to medical knowledge rather than a legacy of death. The case stands as a warning about how isolation, whether physical or psychological, can nurture delusion and enable evil, and how the breakdown of community oversight and connection creates vulnerabilities that predators instinctively exploit. In the end, the Chapman boarding house murders remind us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural entities but human beings who have convinced themselves that their crimes serve a higher purpose, and that eternal vigilance is the price of preventing such horrors from recurring in new forms.